would like to invite dear colleague Gábor Klaniczay, who is VIP in the field of the hagiography in Europe. He is a university professor at Eötvös Loránd Eötvös University in Budapest and also at CU, Central European University. And as I said, he is, his main field are the saints, mainly the royal saints, religious life in the high Middle Ages. And I am very pleased that you can speak with us in our Carolinum. So welcome, and it's your floor.
Thank you. I will try to share my screen.
And I forgot, excuse me, the theme is now the theme of Professor Klaniczay is a new chapter of the Christianization of Central European cards, the saintly princesses of the 13th century.
Do you see my screen now?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah. So let me start. First of all, let me thank you this kind invitation, and I'm very sorry not to be present physically in Prague. It would have been very nice, but the situation is well. And I must say also that I enjoyed tremendously this tournament around the problem of Christian, the legend of Christian, and also the whole set of lectures on Saint Ludmila. Let me start my lecture. In the past 1.5 days, in connection with the historical role and the impressive cult of Saint Ludmila, we had a new and many-sided insight into how the veneration of the female founding saint of the ruling dynasty could contribute to the Christianization of a country in medieval Europe. This factor received a special attention in the fairly recent comparative project organized by Nora Bered on Christianization and the rise of Christian monarchy, where beside Polish, Scandinavian and Hungarian scholars, also two Czech colleagues, Dusan Češčík and Josef Zemlička, took part, confirming the words of St. Paul, sanctifying the unbelieving husband through his wife, which had been mentioned so many times in this conference. Examined in detail by Martin Homza, these mulieres suadentes were central figures in the Christianization of Central and Eastern Europe. And I have to express my regrets that her legend is not included in the volume I recently edited on the saints of the Christianization age. Christianization is, however, a much longer and broader process in this region, extending well into the Central Middle Ages. As a rejoinder to the themes around the first millennium, I will discuss a new 13th century phase of this process, also related to saintly women within the ruling dynasties of Central Europe. This new religious breakthrough of women, further promoting Christianization in their royal and princely courts, was very intensively supported by the mendicant orders. While in Italy and in the south of France, Franciscans and Dominicans above all fought heresies and reformed urban religious life, in Central and Northern Europe, their first objective was to juxtapose voluntary poverty to courtly splendor and curtail the abuse of secular power by charitable investments. The best allies of the mendicant preachers in this field were the saintly queens and the princesses. One example stands out here, that of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, the wife of the Thuringian Landgrave Louis II, who became the most popular new female saint of the late Middle Ages. Around 2007, there was a torrent of new publications of her on the occasion of the 800th anniversary of her birth. As well known, the planned marriage which brought Elizabeth, daughter of King Andrew II of Hungary, to the Thuringian court was promoted by one of the artisans of a new political dynastical alliance in the eastern part of the Holy Roman Empire, the rising house of Andechs-Meran, from which Gertrude, wife of Andrew II, originated, and Hedwig, wife of Henry the Bearded, Prince of Silesia, also, incidentally, Agnes, third wife of Philip II, King of France. The links between the Arpad and the Przemysl dynasty had been forced by the marriage of Przemysl Ottokar and Constance, sister of King Andrew II. The marriage alliance which defined the fate of Saint Elizabeth, the planned dynastic link between the Arpadians and the Thuringian Ludoving dynasty, yet another upcoming regional power in the times of Landgrave Hermann I, was part of this network. An important set of alliances. Its memory is eternalized in the famous Landgrafen Psalter from 1211-13, where Thuringian, Czech and Hungarian ruling couples are represented side by side. This political alliance on the side of Emperor Frederick II was also at the basis of the 5th and 6th Crusade, where first Andrew II of Hungary and Leopold VI of Austria from the Babenberg, yet another emerging Central European dynasty, took part in 1217-18, and subsequently the following venture, it was the brief attempt at the Sixth Crusade, which cost the life of Elizabeth's husband Ludwig IV, who died in 1227 in Otranto on the way to the Holy Land. The Thuringian court, where Elizabeth was transferred as a child, was one of the rising centers of the new secular courtly culture, reputed to be the scene of lascivious courtly fashions and poetic tournaments, with the participation of Walter von der Vogelweide and Wolfram von Eschenbach. The memory of this is also preserved in the memory of the famous Wartburg Krieg, where, according to a later legend of Elizabeth, the mysterious figure Klingsor von Ungerland drew the attention upon the birth of a potential wife candidate, Elizabeth. It was the Christianization of this exploding courtly culture which became one of the objectives of the rising mendicant orders at the beginning of the 13th century. The grown-up Elizabeth, married to Landgrave Louis II, amazed the world with her conversion under the influence of a Franciscan friar, Rodeger, becoming a patron of this new ideal of voluntary poverty, then by submitting herself humbly to the stern, often brutal spiritual guidance of Conrad of Marburg, an independent crusade preacher. Her charity, feeding the poor, caring for sick children, refusing courtly luxury at pompous feasts, doing, despite her royal origins, manual work such as weaving, her turning the palace of Wartburg to a kind of hospital, juxtaposing a kind of heavenly court to the previously lascivious Thuringian secular court. Although she bore 3 children to Ludwig, she became a new model of realizing saintly life within marriage, converting her husband as well to pious spiritual life. Ludwig could be persuaded to depart for crusade and died on the road, and Elizabeth mourned him with tears, but accepted this religious choice with agreement. As a widow, Elizabeth founded a hospital for lepers in Marburg and moved there to treat the sick, endangering her life by the frequent contacts with the contracted, which seemed to be an exaggeration even for Master Conrad, who punished her with severe flogging. The early death and the exploding cult of Elizabeth, canonized in 1235, convinced also the mighty royal and princely families to support this new ideal and take benefit from this glamour. Pope Gregory IX also stressed it in a letter to Queen Beatrice of Castile, where he urged her to follow the example of the new saint, this precious pearl, as he said. He also mentioned Elizabeth's cousin, Agnes of Bohemia, where her inspiration has already made a wonderful effect. Inebriated by Elizabeth's example, Agnes turned down her royal, even imperial suitors. She founded a hospital at a convent of the Poor Clares in 1234 in Prague, where she lived for the rest of her life. I quote, joining the company of sacred virgins going with burning lamps to meet their bridegroom. Indeed, St. Elizabeth's cult generated a mighty impact in most European courts. It initiated a mendicant and female reform movement to redesign courtly society. The sense of this impact is well epitomized by a phrase of Mechtild of Magdeburg, a late 13th century Beguine, who wrote the following in her Das fließende Licht der Gottheit. Asking the God how it was that Elizabeth had been able to acquire such great fame during her short life, the Lord answered her as follows. Elizabeth was my ambassador to the unbelieving damsels who sit around in their castles in gross immorality, doing nothing but dallying with men and just whiling away the time. She alerted them and showed them the right direction. And a great many women who had the will and the ability have followed her example. In my books and studies, I have dealt in detail with this process, how several European princesses got associated to recently founded mendicant convents related to these in royal and princely courts. Martin Homza made also an allusion to that this morning. These convents became kinds of alternative power centers. And the pious princesses in these convents, allied with their mendicant confessors, were showing up a just and religious way of exercising power, refusing secular opulence and luxury, pleading for peace and fair judgment, opposing a kind of female-dominated heavenly court to the secular, worldly one they have turned their back to. I have labeled these saintly princesses Filiae Sanctae Elizabeth in my book. They're joint and interrelated cults based on personal acquaintance and close genealogical ties, too numerous to be enumerated here, promoted by their Franciscan and Dominican confessors and legend writers, documented also in canonization processes, constitute a fascinating corpus of documents on the whole role of women in Christianization of Central Europe. I will try to provide some brief insights to this network. Elizabeth's maternal aunt, Saint Hedwig of Silesia, embarked on the road to heavenly glory sooner than her niece, but outlived her by more than a decade. So her veneration as a saint started only later, after 1267. She was married to Henry I the Bearded, Prince of Silesia, and she bore 7 children to her husband. Then, in 1209, the princely couples took a solemn vow of abstinence. From then on, Hedwig spent most of her time in the Cistercian abbey founded for her daughter, Gertrude, in Trebnitz in 1202. She venerated the saintly nuns, saintly nuns in a very peculiar manner. She regularly kissed the stairs of their stall or their dirty towels. She collected their bathing water and used it to heal the eyes of ill children. And in a vision, she received the blessing of a moving crucifix for her piety. Elizabeth's example inspired Hedwig and her husband to found a women's hospital for lepers in Neumarkt around 1230. She was caring about the lepers, cleaning and even kissing their wounds, to a point that, according to an anecdote of Cesarius of Heisterbach, titled De Ducitia Leprosa, she got even contracted with this illness. It was around the same time that she switched her allegiance from the Cistercians to the Franciscans. The Friars Minor arrived in Wrocław in 1232, and presumably it was at this point that she chose the Franciscan Herbert for her confessor. Hedwig must have followed the process of Elizabeth's canonization closely. We know that she managed to acquire Elizabeth's black kerchief, a prize relic indeed. When she died, they covered her head with this same black kerchief, which then passed on to her daughter Gertrude, the abbess of Trettnitz. Hedwig, however, did not lose her influence in the worldly matters of politics either. On the contrary, with her religious prestige, she returned strengthened to the worldly matters. She intervened in judgments of secular courts, showing more merciful face of power. There are other miniatures in the Hedwig Codex which illustrate this, which unfortunately I didn't manage to get here. And then she also went to embassy to Mazovia to liberate her husband for captivity. She could exercise really a new kind of secular power as well. Now let me turn to Agnes of Bohemia. The new style of saintly way of life dominating the court of, first to Anne of Bohemia, the sister of Agnes of Bohemia. New style of saintly way of life dominating the court of Silesia had a serious impact upon the daughter-in-law of Hedwig, Anne of Bohemia, the sister of Agnes. Her veneration to Elizabeth is attested by her donation of some mass vestments to the Church of St. Elizabeth in Marburg. And in 1250, she presented the abbey at Trebnitz with a gold and silver encrusted rib of Elizabeth's, adorned the altar dedicated to her with a gold embroidered altar cloth prepared perhaps by herself. She was widowed in 1241. Her husband Henry was, as well known, killed in the Tartar invasion. And after several years spent in Silesia as regent for her sons, she ended up following Agnes's example. In 1257, she founded a convent of Poor Clares in Wroclaw, where she could retire, and there she spent her remaining years. She was also venerated as a saint after her death in Poland, though she never got canonized. As for Agnes of Bohemia, I should not be very detailed here, but some significant events and texts should be still remembered. Daughter of King Przemysl Ottokar I and Constance of Hungary, the aunt of Saint Elizabeth, her life began, like that of many other royal daughters, with a series of attempts to give her to a convenient dynastic marriage. At the age of 3, she was given to live at the court of Henry the Bearded and Hedwig of Silesia as the intended wife of their oldest son, but when he died, she was returned to Prague. Subsequent prospective bridegrooms included Henry VII, son of Emperor Frederick II, Henry III of England, and even Emperor Frederick II himself, if we can believe the sources. Finally, she was left to seek company more to her liking and became very close to the Franciscans, who had settled in Prague in 1233. Her first step towards religious patronage was made, as already mentioned, by solemnly founding a hospital for the ill people to be cared for by the Knights of the Red Cross in Prague. Not long thereafter, on Pentecost Sunday of 1234, she entered the Central Europe's first convent of Poor Clares in Prague, founded by her, to live there the rest of her life. Agnes pledged her life to her heavenly bridegroom in a ceremonial sequence very similar to the one in which St. Clare had joined the community led by St. Francis some 20 years earlier. Like Clare, who had gone to take her vows on Palm Sunday, looking her loveliest, so Agnes appeared in church dressed for the last time in her most sumptuous attire. As her legend says, aglow with the flame of mystical love and scorning royal pomp and worldly glory, like an innocent dove fleeing the deluge menacing this world, flitted into the sacred ark of religion with 7 of the noblest virgins of the kingdom. The admiring tone of the famous epistles addressed to her by Clare of Assisi provide a vivid expression of the enthusiasm by which the continuation of Elizabeth's example was contemplated from Italy. The text is here. Now I will skip not to take too much time. As for the role of Agnes's role in her heavenly court, whose spirituality of voluntary poverty and ascetic exercises is described in detail in her legend, Candor Lucis Aeternae, 2 elements should be mentioned briefly. The strict principles of poverty did not make Clare's community less aristocratic. King Wenceslas I, Agnes's brother, and the Bohemian nobility made more than certain that the sisters lacked for nothing and had plenty left for generous almsgiving, turning secular gifts into a religiously distributed gift. Agnes of Bohemia also had an important political role. An extended correspondence with the popes Gregory IX and Innocent IV remained. Papal legates advised the popes to use her as a mediator towards the Bohemian king. She also played a role in the peace that her brother, King Wenceslas I, made in 1249 with his young rebellious son and heir, the future Otakar Przemysl II. After Wenceslas' troops retook Prague from the noble rebels, the king and his son met in the convent of Agnes and were reconciled there. Wenceslas had himself crowned a second time in the Church of the Poor Clares on the Feast of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary in the presence of his saintly sister and his humble son. Ottokar seems to have resented his aunt after he legitimately succeeded to the throne in 1253. He lost no time finding an excuse to prohibit Agnes, who carried on an extensive correspondence with the policy after that. But she was retained from meddling in his political affairs. On the other hand, Agnes's convent became a center for fostering the Przemyślids dynastic traditions after King Wenceslas I chose to be buried in the monastery of her sister. Agnes in 1253 had a little mausoleum built in the convental church, a chapel founding the tombs of the rest of the family, and the chapel of the Redeemer was consecrated in 1261 in the presence of Agnes and Ottokar II the Przemysl with very nice carved heads of kings, and also some daughters of Przemysl Ottokar II were buried there. Let me turn now to Margaret of Hungary, who fits very well to this series. The eighth child of King Bela IV and Maria Lascaris was born on 27th January in 1242 in Klis, after the attack of the marauding Tartars, and the parents were flying there and dedicated their daughter as a sacrifice or expiation to the service of God. And as the Tatars withdrew, she was sent to the Dominican convent, first to Veszprém, then to another one constructed specially for her at the Lepers Island near Buda in 1252, with 18 of her companions, and spending the rest of her life there. She could not avoid fully the fate of royal daughters either. Her father made time and again efforts to involve her in dynastic marriage to Charles of Anjou, to various Polish and Galician princes, and to Ottokar Przemysl II also, efforts which Margaret, true to her religious vows, successfully resisted, menacing to cut her nose and lips to render herself ugly if her father insisted. Meanwhile, she tirelessly emulated Saint Elizabeth in her charitable activities, caring for sick, feeding the poor, transmitting donations she received from her family to hospices or to the poor sisters, humiliating herself with tiresome manual labor in the cloister. Her body was wasted by this life of strict asceticism. She died when she was barely 28 years old. As for a religious influence on politics, a case similar to that of Agnes of Bohemia could be mentioned. At a time of protracted and devastating war between King Bela IV and Stephen V, the junior king, in a fiery passage decrying the tyranny of the mighty, the legend of Saint Margaret tells us how the princess tried to mediate between her father and her brother. The peace treaty between the father and son was finally signed on the island of Lepers, quite probably in Margaret's cloister in March 1266. The oldest legend of her life, there is also another image of Buddha and the cloister of Margaret. And the oldest legend of her life must have been prepared immediately after her passing away, probably by her Dominican confessor Friar Marcellus, and a year after her death, the brother King Stephen V, in conjunction with the Dominicans, initiated her canonization investigation, which was then duly ordered by Pope Gregory X. And then after a first investigation, a second investigation came, recording the testimonies of more than 110 witnesses, among them 38 Dominican nuns, a valuable testimony on the everyday life of the community around Margaret and her heavenly court. Well, this series of examples could be continued, but the time is out. I would just project the image of Krakow to remember the saintly princesses Salome, wife of the brother of Bela IV, who after becoming a widow because of Koloman was killed in 1241 in the Mongolian attack, returned to her brother Boleslaus the Shy and became a cleric sister there. And Saint Kinga, the wife of the latter, who lived in a virginal marriage with her husband, and after becoming a widow founded the Claris convent in Novi Sanch. And these foundations have recently been analyzed by a number of works. Let me mention here an English young historian, Kirsty and Day, who wrote a very nice thesis on them. Then the metaphor of heavenly court could also be extended to the west and to the south, to the Capetians. Louis IX and his sister Isabel of France studied in admirable monographs by Jacques Le Goff and Schoenfield of the Naples Angevins, who carried on this tradition with direct Central European links, relying on their belonging to the Beata Stirps of the saintly lineage of both Arpadians and the Capetians. But for the presentation of this, there is no more time here, just a moment to stress that this new Christianization, this ongoing Christianization process of the 13th century, with the role of these saintly princesses and their allied mendicant confessors, is a very important phase that concludes it partly in the royal courts, turning the religious spirit of the royal courts of Central Europe, a very important one by the 14th century, which also Bohemia could experience in the time of Charles IV. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gábor. It was perfect. So we knew now that not only the foundation persons of the Central European states, as LUDMILA and the other, but also the big group of the new saints from 13th century were very important in this second wave of the Christianization of Central Europe. Please, do you have any questions, any contribution to this paper? There is somebody. Gregor Spatz, please.
Gábor, thank you very much for this very inspiring paper. I would like just to stress that I like that the fact that you stress this interesting point that there is a sort of continuity in this hagiography of holy women, that we can find similar things in those from the early Middle Ages and the ones you described, like this. I don't know. For example, this role in the marriage when they convince their husbands for a pious action, for mercy and so on. But on the other hand, there is also, as you stress, this completely new spirit in this new movement. This spirit related with mendicants mainly. I like very much this sentence of André Vaucher, who said that this difference can be very well seen when one compare the life of St. Margaret of Scotland and St. Elizabeth, when one is funding the monasteries and another is funding the hospital to serve herself there. So this is this very interesting moment when we have a lot of continuation. Obviously, we can guess, I mean, not obviously, but we can guess that those women or her hagiographers also know this older hagiographies, so they are inspired by it. But on the other hand, we can also see that something changed, and this change, as you showed, that it was quite big. In fact, it was something really new, and this is quite interesting that this phenomenon, which is related with mendicants, so can be probably found everywhere in Europe, more or less. This new type of piety is so much important in this part of Europe, in the cults of this part of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just a very brief reaction. Indeed, I think that the hagiographic tradition is very important, and one can see this, for example, reaching back to the early Middle Ages. She has not been mentioned so many times, but Radegund, the legend of Radegund, for example, the nightly prayer was very similar. I think the novelty, as you stressed, and that might be important, the novelty is that the 13th century legend of Elizabeth is very new, that she did not refuse marriage, but rather she converted the husband to allow her this new religious choice without refusing him as a person. And that is a very interesting, new and richer image, which is actually corresponding to a new vision on marriage in general in medieval Christianity. And I would say that if one reaches back to these converting women in the 11th century, 10th, 11th century, the interesting thing is we know little about them, but actually they were not so much sanctified for refusing their husbands as Radegund, but rather siding their husbands, like Gisela, for example, although she was accused at one point, but not by the husband.
Thank you. Professor Homza.
So, first of all, I'm very glad to see you, Gábor, at least on my screen. And of course, it is really nice to hear your voice and even your thoughts. And in spite of the fact that we are not so far from each other, you are in Budapest and I am in Bratislava, we do not have so many possibilities to meet each other. But still, our thoughts are approaching each other, and there is some question what I would like to give you. Of course, I see this central position of the court of Arcadians in the 13th century in the development of new wave of saintly women, saintly queens and princesses, but still I have several candidates for comparison with them, and namely there is Saint Eufrosina of Polotsk, which is the patroness of Belarus of today, and Saint Tamara of Georgia, and Saint Helena of Serbia, and still I do not know what they do have in common, whether they or their no ideologies, but people who stands behind their saintly life. They were aware about some kind of net through Europe, through confessions, but still in the frame of Christianity.
Thank you for this comment, Martin. I'm very glad, and I enjoyed very much this morning's presentation too. And I think you have the merit to reach out for these less discussed examples, which are also following a very similar model. So I know that the Arpadians, for example, had a very big network of marriage policies through all the Balkans as well. and also these marriage policies were reaching out to the East as well, and these examples should also be part of this type of comparative examination. It's a pity that they are less documented, precisely because it was on the margins also, and that is a very interesting thing, on the margins of Latin Christianity and Orthodox Christendom, and this is still a task to be done. Evelyn Patlajon had a very interesting essay on pointing out how in the 12th, 13th century, a new network of Christianizing courts were joining the whole European dynastic network and political network, which then by the Mongolian attack was partly crushed, but still was very important to take in consideration. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That can be many things, and not only the Hungarian princes were on the margin of Christianity, but the Hungarian princesses were also married for the Czech kings. For instance, this case of Přemysl Otakar II and his wife Kunigunde of Mačva.
Yeah.
So this is a good example. Her father was Orthodox, Rastislav of Chernigov, and the second example, this Constancia of Hungary, the daughter of Belo IV, was married to Lev Danielovich in Lvov, and there are several examples which work somehow together, and yes, this can be good and new research which can be done on the field as well, but still, you see, it has some impact into our Ludmila as well in Prague.
Exactly. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to all speakers, and especially to Gábor Klaniczay. Many greetings to Budapest, also from me.